Good evening, everyone. My name is Juwon Park, and I'm the curatorial assistant for Korean art here at the Asian Art Museum. And I'm so honored to be here to be part of the program and to moderate this conversation between Ahree Lee here, who flew in from LA yesterday and who's on the floor with me, and Suknam, who is virtually joining us from Korea, from her studio in Korea, with the help of interpreter Grace Kim. Just another quick reminder that this is a hybrid program and this is our first time trying out this hybrid format at the museum. So thank you for your patience already, but I hope you also understand once we get if we get any glitches throughout the program. And let me introduce the artist really quick, and then we'll watch a 10-minute video about Yoon Sung-nam and her life and work. And then Ahree here will give us a presentation on her works. And then we'll start a conversation followed by Q&A. Yoon Sung-nam, born in 1939 in Korea, came to art late in life at the age of 40 after studying traditional calligraphy and writing. She's been a pioneer of feminist art in Korea, even when feminism was largely unknown in the country. And Ahree Lee here was born in Seoul in 1971 and grew up in Philadelphia. She currently works and lives in LA, and her works explore the issues of identity and personal narrative using the interdisciplinary approach. So let's watch the video first, and then we'll listen to Ahree.
사실은요, 화가가 되고 싶다 이런 생각을 아주 어린 나이에 한 10살쯤 됐을 때 했는데 아버지 덕분에 화가란 직업이 있는 건 알았어요. 그런데 아버님이 일찍 돌아가셨거든요. 제가 고등학교 1학년 쪽에. 그래서 도저히 화가는 될 수 없다. 포기했죠. 어머니 혼자 해가지고 동생들 공부는 못 시키는 거야. 동생들 밑으로 넷이나 있어요. 걔네들 다 뭐 10대야. 그러면 어떻게 하겠어요? 내가 벌어서 얘네들 공부를 시켜야 돼. 어머니가 너는 뭐 직장 생활에서 애들 공부시켜야 돼 이런 말씀 단 한 번도 하신 적이 없지만 내 스스로 난 동생들 공부시켜야 돼. 나는 못했지만 얘네들 시켜야 돼. 그래서 내가 취직해가지고 거의 10년 동안 얘네들 대학 공부시키기까지 아마 거의 다 했다고 봐요. 막내는 물론 아니지만 그거는 이제 어머니가 하셨지만 아무튼 그렇게 하고 나니까 결혼도 하고 뭐 시어머니 모시고 또 아이도 하나 낳고 살다 보지만 살아왔지만 이 삶이 나를 충족시키지 못하는 거예요. 늘 뭔가가 이게 가슴이 먹먹하고 늘 뭔가 부족해. 나는 그림을 그려야 돼. 내 어렸을 때 하고 싶었던 거를 해야 돼. 이제는 먹고 사는 거 해결했잖아. 40살 되는 해 4월 25일 날 내 정확하게 날짜를 기억하는 내 친구의 선생님이 나를 방문했는데 걔가 홍대를 나왔어. 그림을 그리는 친구야. 내가 너무 그림 그리고 싶다 그랬더니 언니 뭐 당장 합시다. 그리고 날 끌고 나가서 이 물감만 파는 데더라고요. 거기 가서 물감을 몽땅 사왔기 때문에 4월 25일이라는 걸 알았죠. 가정주부로 사는 것 자체가 나쁘다 이런 게 아니라 나하고는 안 어울리는 것 같은. 그러니까 내가 이것 말고 가정주부로서의 삶이라는 건 내가 살기 위해서 먹고 살기 위해서 하나의 직업으로 생각을 하지 이게 내 생명을 다 바쳐서 여기 올인할 수 있는 직업은 아닌 거예요. 그러니까 내가 올인할 수 있는 직업이라는 건 뭔가 내가 정말 여러 가지 형편이 안 좋아서 못했지만 뭐 이제라도 늦는다는 시간이 늦었다는 생각을 해본 적도 없어요. 지금이라도 시작하니까 이게 기쁨이죠. 기쁨이고 정말 그림 시작했을 때 그 기쁨은 아마 내가 말로 다 표현을 못할 정말 어, 정말 정말 남의 말에 의해서 내가 온 힘을 다해서 거기다 바쳤다. 2년 후에 개인전을 했어요. 근데 그때 주제가 그림은 주제가 있어야 되잖아요. 그거는 이제 알고 있었어. 근데 난 그리고 싶은 대상이 정물도 아니고 풍경도 아니고 난 인물이에요. 근데 인물을 사실은 나 자신을 그리고 싶었겠죠. 근데 나 자신 그리기에는 너무 자기 자신이 보잘것이 없어. 그래서 제가 이 세상에서 가장 존경하고 사랑하는 사람이 누굴까? 그게 내 친정 어머니더라고. 돌아가셨지만 지금까지도 내가 가장 사랑하고 존경하는 인물이에요. 시어머니 모시고 살았거든요. 그러면서 친정어머니를 일주일에 한 번씩 오시라 그래가지고 친정어머니를 드로잉을 하고, 그래서 첫 번째 개인전 제목이 어머니였어요. 이 팜프렛에 어머니라는 제목을 붙였어. 내 개인 어머니인데 어머니가 굉장히 수줍은 분이라서 얼굴을 똑같이 하는 걸 싫어하시더라고. 그래서 이제 물론 이제 좀 변형도 시키고, 그리고 이렇게 시장에서 물건 파는 어머니 또는 뭐 노동하는 어머니, 그렇게 해서 우리를 키웠기 때문에. 82년도에 개인전을 하고 난 때 그 개인전 장소에서 김인순 씨를 만나고 몇 년이 그러니까 1년인가 2년쯤 지나니까 또 김진숙이라는 분을 또 그 홍대 나오신 분이에요. 한 아파트의 옆에 방에 옆집에 살고 계시더라고요. 그래서 이제 알게 돼가지고 그도 그리고 싶어 하고 가정주부고, 그러니까 셋이 딱 맞은 거야. 이게 맞아서 우리가 정말 이게 같이 3인전 했으면 좋겠다라는 얘기를 했어요. 그 10월 모임이라는 그 그룹을 만들었어. 근데 그 10월 모임도 김인순 씨가 만든 거예요. 그러니까 김인순 씨만 해도 그때만 해도 굉장히 의식이 아주 투철해가지고 러시아의 10월 혁명을 생각한 거예요. 러시아의 10월 혁명을 생각해서 우리 10월이란 말을 넣자. 그때가 엄중한 나라, 우리나라는. 그래도 이 친구가 10월, 너무 나는 좋았어요. 그 이름이. 김인순 씨 최고. 첫 번째 전시를 했는데 관현미술관에서 했어요. 1층 김진수, 2층 김인순, 3층 윤석남, 이렇게 해서 3인전을 했는데 그 3인전을 하면서 작가와의 대화라는 게 있잖아요. 작가와의 대화를 우리 세 명이 딱 앉아서 이제 하는데 사람들이 굉장히 많이 온 거예요. 근데 그 관중 속에 여성주의 공부를 하는 여성학자들이 있었던 거예요. 그 여성학자들이, 그러니까 이대에 계시던 분들이 오셔가지고 질문을 하는데 정말 여성 미술이라는 말을 거의 처음 인식하게 된 거고, 그때는 우리는 여성 미술이라는 말도 없었어. 사실 그 전시할 때도. 쉬운 모임이라는 얘기만 했지 여성 미술이라는 얘기도. 그때 그분들의 질문이 지금은 내가 일일이 다 얘기할 수 없지만 그게 그 질문에서 우리가 너무나 많은 걸 배웠다고요. 그래서 정말 우리가 하는 것이 여성 미술이구나. 처음에 시작할 때 어머니였잖아요. 조선이라는 나라, 그러니까 한국에서 태어난 여성이잖아요. 이 여성이 살아온 과정이 있는 거야. 그 과정이 우리가 평등하게 살아왔습니까? 남성들하고? 절대로 평등하게 살아오. 내 의식 속에도 내 남자 동생 3명 공부해야 돼. 난 공부 안 해도 돼. 이건 뭐예요? 이게 자기 자신이 이미 그 동생들 남성에 대한 여성을 하등화시킨 거죠. 내 의식 속에 이미 그게 박혀 있는 거예요. 아주 뼛속같이. 이 박혀 있는 게 뼛속에까지 박혀 있는 이 의식을 하루아침에 어떻게 아무리 그림을 미친 듯이 그리지 않아 세상 없어도 바꿀 수 없는 거예요. 바꿔지지도 않아. 그렇지만 초석은 놓을 수 있어. 시작은 할 수 있잖아. 그러면 시작을 하면 100년이고 200년이고 우리의 의식 속에 남성 우대, 여성 하대라는 의식이 전혀 없는 하나의 인간으로 동등한 세계가 될 수 있는 이 세계가 어느 때가 반드시 온다 이거죠. 그 올 때가 100년 후인지 200년 후인지를 몰라. 그러나 거기에 내가 일조를 하고 있어 나는. 그러니까 그림이라는 것이 그냥 봐서 아름답다, 좋다, 느낌이 좋다 이렇게 해서 끝날 수도 있지만 그거보다 이 사람이 어떤 뜻을 가지고 무슨 얘기를 하고 있는 거지? 라고 보는 분들이 그 작가의 의도까지 생각할 수 있는 그림이 나는 시도를 하고 싶어요. 나는 그렇게 가고 싶어요. 남들이야 뭐 아름다운 것만 추구하든지 말든지 나는 그러고 싶어요. 그 얘기를 아름다운 색깔, 아름답지 않아도 좋아. 그림이라는 어떤 뭐 붓을 한번 이렇게 흩어져도 좋으니까 그런 행위를 통해서 얘기하고 싶은 게 여성으로 태어난 이 땅의 여성으로 태어난 윤석남이가 나의 얘기를 하고 싶어. 나의 얘기라는 건 결국 먼 몇천 년 전의 여성 얘기가 내 몸 안에 들어와 있는 거야. 그러니까 이거를 나는 끄집어내야 돼. 그래서 역사 속에 나온 여성들 보면니까 정말 그 수천 명, 수만 명의 유명한 시인들, 뭐 화가들 이렇게 있는 중에 여성은 정말 몇 명 불과하더라고. 그것도 허난선언은 안 그렇지만 임혜창은 기생이잖아. 그래서 기생이요. 그러니까 얼마나 하대를 받았어. 그 위대한 시인들이. 그러니까 그것도 또 화가 나는 거야. 그 사람들 다 그려야 돼. 그래가지고 그냥 그리면 재미없어. 이 사람들이 지금 현재까지 살아있어. 살아있다는 뜻은 뭐냐면 윤석남이라는 이 화가를 만나서 자기들 얘기를 하고 있는 거야. 그래서 실제로 헌안선언 만들어가지고 내가 손 둘이 이렇게 맞는 것까지 했잖아.
Great. Thank you for the beautiful video. I'm really inspired by how the idea of mother developed into drawing multiple women in history and other women in Yoon's life. And let's hear Ahree's presentation and we'll dive right into conversation.
Thank you for inviting me here today. Though Yoon Suknam and I share Korean heritage, unlike her, I grew up on a different continent and in a different era. I was born in Seoul in 1971. Oh. Does that work? Did it work? Oh, okay, great. I was born in Seoul in 1971, but a few months later, my parents and I emigrated to the United States, among the first wave of families to benefit from the Immigration and Nationality Act, which reversed a decades-long restriction on the number of Asians permitted to emigrate to the US. My parents eventually settled us in suburban Philadelphia, where I grew up with the privileges and opportunities of a middle-class American life, thanks to my parents' hard work and self-sacrifice. Yet at the same time, I experienced a subtle racism of a society not quite ready to embrace us. Is this going to work? Oh, okay, great. I studied English in college, then became a graphic designer, ultimately returning to school for an MFA in graphic design. I created this video, Me, as a part of my thesis work. I started it as an experiment. Take a photo of myself every day, put the photos together into a video. And I thought about how the photo only captures a point in time, yet is supposed to represent the totality of a person. And also the Vanitas tradition of still life painting, in which the subject, usually flowers or fruit, is depicted in the height of freshness and beauty, but implicit in that is that the subject will soon wither and die. Years later, in 2006, after it had a successful run at several film festivals, I submitted it to an online video gallery. It instantly went viral, was ripped off my website, and posted it to YouTube, where it got 1 million views in a couple of days. Despite of, or perhaps because of its popularity, me became a lightning rod for sexist, racist comments left in the videos page on YouTube. Meanwhile, a white male imitators video every day, posted 2 weeks after mine, received overwhelmingly positive comments and skyrocketed past me in numbers of views, likely buoyed by societal bias and YouTube algorithms that reflect that bias. This might have been an exciting and joyous moment to see my work have such an impact on the world, but instead I was on an emotional roller coaster dealing with the hateful comments, pirated versions popping up all over the internet, and the anxiety of seeing an imitator in his video being lauded for his originality and publicly celebrated in the New York Times, international exhibitions, and more. I never intended me to be a socio-political statement, but it became one nonetheless. My mere existence and visibility bothers certain people to no end, but that doesn't stop me from being who I am, taking my daily photo and persisting. Next month is the 20th anniversary of when I began taking photos, and I'm creating an updated version of me for the occasion. In 2015, I was invited by the Asian Art Museum to create a response to anything I wished in the galleries, the collection, or even the community of the museum. I chose for my inspiration a traditional Korean textile called a bojagi. It was made by women for utilitarian purposes around the household, like bundling up blankets or covering food before meal times, and it often made from scraps of leftover material from other things like clothing. Mothers would make a lot of bojagis to give to their daughters as a wedding present, because when they got married, they would go live in their husband's home compounds and very rarely get to see their original families again. For the mothers who made them, they were one of their few modes of expression, as women weren't allowed an education in those days. For the daughters, they were a tactile connection to home. I made 2 videos, one titled Bojagi, Memories to Light, uses home movies from Bay Area Asian American families from an archive called Memories to Light at the Center for Asian American Media. I pieced together these families' memories to make a bojagi for the entire community. In the process of making this video, I watched hours of birthday celebrations, church picnics, family vacations, and everyday family moments. But the experience of watching Asian American families doing these normal things was deeply moving and validating for me. I realized that from growing up surrounded by images in TV, film, and the media of white families as the default, I had created this image in my mind of a default white family when I thought of an American family, contrary to my personal experience growing up in an Asian American family. By seeing these other Asian American families whose presence in the Bay Area went back decades and mirrored my own, I felt a kinship and that my experience was a valid American experience. For the second video, Permutation, I collected portrait photos of the greater Asian Art Museum community. Not only people who worked here, but those who came to events, students participating in youth programs, and anyone who would submit a photo through the website. I pieced them together and animated them with an algorithm that selects random groupings, creating a singular face that is always changing and never the same. I think of how fabric scraps from different garments came together to form a bojagi is not so different from how bits of genetic code passed down from generations of parents come together to form a person. We all have bits of other people in us. And in fact, over 99% of human DNA is shared between all of us. Up until this point, I was exclusively a video and new media artist. But a few years ago, I heard that the technology on which the first computers were based was derived from weaving looms, and that the first computer program was written by a woman. Though I had worked in Silicon Valley and the technology industry for a decade, I had never heard this before. I wanted to learn more and found a weaving teacher and started researching the history of the interconnections between weaving and computing, and through it, the interrelationship between craft, women's labor, and technology itself. Oh, am I going backwards? There we go. In the early 1800s, Joseph Marie Jacquard invented a way to speed up the process of weaving complex patterns using punched cards to determine which threads would be lifted or lowered in each row. The inventors of the earliest computers saw that the binary nature of weaving, in which a thread is either lifted above or lowered below the surface of the cloth, was analogous to the binary nature of computing, and used punched cards as input devices for their machines. As recently as the 1960s and 70s, computers were still operated with punch cards. In Ada, two rectangular shapes, roughly the size and proportion of 1960s era IBM punch cards, with black yarn marking spots that correspond to punched holes. It's named for Ada Lovelace, the 19th century woman who wrote the first computer program. She observed that the computer weaves algebraic patterns just as the Jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves, which is the message I encoded in this weaving in punch card code. Women dominated the computing industry at first. Not only did a woman write the first computer program, but the teams who programmed the earliest computers like ENIAC were mostly women. And women graduating from college with math degrees in the 1950s reaped the benefit of a new boom in workplaces needing computer programmers. Computing was seen as a women's work. And yet, as computer programming became seen as a lucrative and valued occupation, more men moved into the field until they dominated and the women disappeared. The dominant image of a computer programmer became a nerdy boy. And as the work became associated with men, the value and the pay of that work went up. I was working at a tech company when my daughter was born. I went from a highly paid tech worker to an unpaid stay-at-home parent. Meanwhile, the work I did as a mother was harder and more relentless than anything I ever encountered at my tech job. Why should certain kinds of labor be paid handsomely and others nothing? Parenting labor isn't any less valuable than tech labor, and if anything, it's more important. This piece is a data visualization of 1 week of my labor as a parent and an artist. For several weeks in 2018, I kept track of what I was doing all day in a spreadsheet. Each activity I assigned to one of half a dozen different categories, including childcare, housework, art practice, and sleep. I translated each of those categories into a type of yarn and made this visualization of my labor. People enjoy finding patterns in my behavior and making comparisons to their own, especially fellow parents who empathize with my wide bands of childcare and narrow bands of leisure and sleep. Through this weaving, I immortalize my hours of cooking, driving, school carpool, and homework supervision, and bands of cotton or linen. I'm not only making invisible domestic labor visible, I'm an alchemist, transforming it into an artwork with cultural and monetary value. In each of my bodies of work, I'm piecing together a bigger pattern out of fragments of images and history, and in the process revealing hidden or forgotten people and stories. I hope that through my own experiences and perspective, I can connect others to their own power.
Thank you for the great presentation, Ahree. I'm surprised by the historical association between weaving and coding, and computer engineering is still mostly associated with dominantly with men's field, whereas craft is still considered as more domestic women's labor. So in your work, let us remember the pioneering role of women in the history of science and technology. So let's go back up a little bit and start with the works in the exhibition Likeness and Legacy in Korean Portraiture, which is right across from the from the staircase here at the museum. And if you haven't, you should definitely check it out later. And I want to ask you some questions, both you and Yoon. And we have 3 works total by Yoon Suknam. And 2 of them are her series portraying historical women, Hwaseong and Lee Chang, whose portraits were never made during the Joseon dynasty. And another work is genealogy, which depicts one woman in two different forms against the background of genealogy papers, where only men's names were allowed to be recorded. So to me, at least, Yoon's works serve as tributes to the neglected women in the history of Korea. And then we have Ahree's permutation, as we saw in the presentation, which is a video installation of that shows sliced photographs of different human beings, mostly local here, and a lot of our staff members, who are the snippets of them creating one person's, like you said, totality of one face that's constantly moving, but still stays as one face, which is fascinating. And I think looking at these four works by Yoon and Ahree together through the notion of portraiture gives us different ideas about what portraiture can be today, especially. And this is a topic we deal with throughout the likeness exhibition. So I have a very simple question for you and Yoon. What does the idea of portraiture mean to you, and how have your personal experiences informed you in creating these variations of portraiture? I think Yoon can answer first, maybe.
답변해 주시겠어요?
네. 제가 처음 그림을 시작했을 때는 서양화를 시작했었어요. 무조건 한국에서 그림이다 그러면 제 생각에는 서양화였었는데, 그렇게 한 10여 년 만에 제가 국립중앙박물관을 방문한 적이 있는데,
So when I began painting, Western art dominated the art industry in Korea, art community in Korea. So in the very beginning, I started with Western art, and 12 years later, once I visited National Museum of Korea.
그랬는데 거기서 그 주제가 500년 동안의 한국, 그러니까 조선 초상화전이었어요. 그러니까 그 초상화전이라는 거는 500년 동안 그 유명한 정치가들을 그린 그림들이죠. 그 그림들을 보면서 그 중에 한 점에 제가 너무너무 감동받고, 제가 얼마나 허무하게 내 삶을 살아왔는가 하는 걸 느끼게 된 작품이 있거든요. 그게 바로 윤두서라는 분, 약 200 몇십 년 전, 확실하지는 않지만 살았던 양반이신데, 이분이 자화상이었어요.
And the exhibition was on the portraits that were painted over 500 years of Joseon dynasty. And most of them featured the portraits of the famous politicians of Joseon dynasty. And I was actually deeply inspired by one portrait. And this portrait made me realize how meaninglessly I was living. And it was a self-portrait of Yoon Do-seo, who lived several hundred years ago.
500년 전인지 아닌지 확실하지는 않아요. 그게 분명히 얘기를 해줘. 그런데 그 윤두서의 초상화를 보는 순간 제가 얼어붙었거든요. 너무 놀래고, 여태까지 내가 그리온 삶 자체에 대해서 한 가지 그냥 퍽 이렇게 맞은 것 같았어요. 그래서 그래서 그 작품을 몇 번에 걸쳐서 가서 보면서 느낀 것이, 내가 얼마나 자기 자신을 무시하고 있었나라는 생각을 하게 됐거든요.
And this man, Yoon Do-seo, maybe lived several hundred years ago. I'm not sure how long ago, but I was very much stunned by looking at this self-portrait, and I felt like I was hit in my head. I revisited the exhibition several times to view the self-portrait once again.
심지어는 나는 누군가, 나는 한국 사람이야, 난 조선 사람이야 라는 생각도 하게 만들어준 작품이었어요. 그래서 작업실로 돌아와서 그때부터 모든 기법을 다 버리고 한국화, 그러니까 전통 동양화라고 한국어에서는 말하고 있어요. 서양에 반해서 동양화라고. 그래서 종이에다가 한지에다가 붓 그리고 채색을 가지고 하는 작업이니까 저한테는 굉장히 생소했지만 그 전까지의 화법을 다 버리고 다시 이거를 혼자서 공부하기 시작했죠. 선생님.
And that self-portrait asked me several questions. It made me think of my identity, my life, and it even made me think of maybe I am a person from Joseon Dynasty. Anyhow, after seeing this portrait, self-portrait, I gave up my ways of painting up until then, and I started to follow the traditional style, traditional painting. So I started to use such materials such as Korean ink mop, food brush, or I started to color my paintings in traditional way, which was new to me.
이게 저한테는 굉장히 새로운 기법이기 때문에 3년 동안 저를 가르쳐 주신 선생님이 계신데 저보다 나이가 한 20살은 젊으신 현정이라는 분이 계시는데요. 그분한테 이제 3년 동안 그 기법을 배웠어요. 그러니까 그 전까지의 서양화 기법을 다 버리고 다시 한국화 기법을 가지고 공부를 3년 동안 한 다음에 그 다음부터 주제를 제가 가장 감명을 받은 것이 윤두소 초상화이고 저도 초상화에 관심이 많았었기 때문에 초상화에다가 중점을 두면서 작업을 하기 시작했죠.
So the style was totally new to me. So I was taught by an artist who was 20 years younger than me, artist Kim Hyun-jung, for 3 years. So I transitioned from Western art to Korean art. And ever since then, I also had to pick a motive or subject to draw. And I was inspired by the self-portrait of Yoon Do-seo, and I was very much interested in portraits. So I decided to paint portraits since then.
저는 물론 이 그림이라는 것이 그림이라는 것이 어떻게 그러니까 그 초상화라는 것은 수천 년 동안 지내왔던 거기 때문에 그 방법이 굉장히 새로운 건 아니라는 생각이 들었죠. 화가의 입장에서는 항상 내가 남들이 가지 않은 길을 내가 새로 개척해야 된다라는 의식이 없을 수가 없어요. 그런데 그런 의식이 있었음에도 불구하고 초상화라는 것은 수천 년 지나왔던 방법이기 때문에 새로운 길이 중요한 것이 아니라 제가 생각하기에는 나는 지금 현재 어떤 새로운 방법이 중요한 게 아니라 내가 무엇을 얘기하고 싶었다라는 것을 확실하게 발견하고 그거를 뚫고 나가야 된다고 생각했기 때문에 초상화를 하게 된 거죠.
Of course, portraiture is several thousand years old and it's nothing new. But as an artist, I believe that artists have to pursue something new. They have to pioneer new movements. But nevertheless, since portraiture has a long history, I concluded that although this is not something new, it is a medium that helps me to deliver my message, to deliver what I want to share with people.
그러니까 그 윤두서의 초상화의 형형한 눈빛하고 머리칼, 그 얼굴의 표정 이런 거를 어떻게 저도 그만한 느낌을 줄 수 있는 작업을 할 수 있을까라고 생각하는 게 지금의 저의 목적입니다.
And so when I saw the self-portrait of Yoon Do-seo, I was deeply touched by his piercing eyes and his facial expression, and I wanted to paint portraits that leave such impressions on people, just as Yoon Do-seo's self-portrait.
네, 제가 또 다른 얘기를 하게 되는지는 모르겠는데 그랬지만 그 초상화에 관심을 두는 대상이 누굴까라는 것을 생각을 안 할 수가 없는 거죠. 그 대상을 저는 36년 동안 한국이 일본의 침략을 받아가지고 국권을 뺏기지 않았습니까? 그 뺏겼을 동안 이 나라를 살리겠다고 총을 들고 싸운 여성들이 있어요. 근데 그 시절이 여성이라는 것이 인간 대우를 제대로 받았습니까? 이조시대 때는 여성은 한 사람의 인간으로 제대로 대접을 받지 였어요. 만약에 내가 그 시절에 태어났다면 정말 과연 이 나라를 위해서 총을 들고 싸웠을까 하는 생각이 들 정도였죠.
And also, I had to consider whom to draw, whom to paint. And as you know, Korea was under Japanese occupation for 36 years, and there were many, many women during that period who were trying to save or liberate the country. And those women were not treated well enough. And the women who lived in Joseon dynasty era weren't treated well enough either. And I thought, if I was born in those years, would I fight for my country? Would I have fought for my country with a gun in my hand?
그렇지만 어쨌든 처음에는 그런 그 여성 그 독립 여성들이 아니라 그 이매창 그러니까 허난설원을 제가 작업을 하게 된 거는 그 500년 동안에 여성들이 많은 여성들이 살았으면서 불구하고 문자화돼서 지금까지도 우리한테 알려진 여성분들이 별로 많지 않은데 그중에 그래도 시라는 그 문학을 통해서 그 어려운 과정에서도 불구하고 그 문학을 통해서 우리 현대 우리까지 전해오는 시를 쓰신 분들이 계세요. 그러니까 그 시를 쓰시고 아주 이른 나이에 그러니까 허난설원 같은 경우는 27살 때 돌아가셨는데요.
마무리를 해주시면 한 번에
27살 때 돌아가셨고요. 그랬지만은 그 27살 전까지의 시가 무지 많아서 그 시가 일본에도 가서 번역이 돼 있고 중국에도 번역이 돼 있고 그리고 한국에도 남아 있고 그러니까 그래서 그분을 작품화하고 싶었어요. 마치 제가 그 허난설원을 400년 전에 허난설원을 만나고 있는 허난설원의 생가가 저 바다 쪽이거든요. 강원도 바다 쪽에서 바다가 있는 데서 내가 이렇게 만나는 장면을 상상하면서 허난설원의 기운을 내가 지금 받고 있어 라는 것을 얘기하고 싶어서 만든 작품이 지금 여기 전시하고 있는 작품이고요. 이매창 같은 경우는 기생이었어요. 그 당시에 기생이 된 건 사람이 아니었어요. 그러니까 본부인으로 갈 수도 없고 남의 첩으로 들어가서 살기도 하고 노래를 불러고 하면서도 살았지만 이 양반은 그럼에도 불구하고 자기가 꿋꿋하게 자기의 정체성을 꿋꿋하게 유지하면서 아주 작은 방에서도 창밖을 보면서 시를 쓰신 분이에요. 그 이매창의 비록 기생이지만 아름다운 그 시들이 많이 남아 있습니다.
And so I also painted historical women from the Joseon dynasty like Lee Mae-chang and Heon Seol, whose portraits are actually featured in the exhibition. And they are the women who had many difficulties because they lived as kiseng. They were not treated well enough during the Joseon dynasty era. But they left, their legacy remains in the forms of literature. They have written many great works of art in forms of poet, and I imagined myself meeting those ladies, for example, Heon Seol, and I imagined that, and so I painted that scenery, and that is the portraiture of Heon Seol, which is also in the exhibition. And in terms of Lee Mae-chang, also she was a kiseng. She was never treated well enough, but she left a lot of awesome and great poems. So I wanted to show that although their portraits do not remain from those ages, I wanted to show that they do have lived and their legacy remains through my portraits.
그리고 너무 얘기가 길어졌는데요. 마지막 작품 그 족보에 대해서 잠깐 설명을 할 것 같으면 족보는 우리나라에서 한 가게의 역사예요. 한 집의 역사를 쭉 정리한 게 족보인데 그 족보가 각 가정마다 다 다르게 가지고 있는데도 불구하고 약 200년 전만 해도 그 족보에 여성들은 이름이 하나도 실려가 있지 않아요. 여성들은 족보에 올라가 있을 수가 없는 무슨 말씀인지 아마 이해하실 거예요. 그래서 그 족보에 올라가지 못하건 여성들이면서도 마치 족보에 올라간 것처럼 근엄하게 아름답게 앉아 있는 그 앞에 그 부인이 있고요. 있고 뒤에 걸려 있는 그 여성은 같은 사람이에요. 이게 한 인물입니다. 한 인물의 외면과 한 인물의 내면은 마치 목이 매달려 있는 것처럼. 그러니까 그거를 조선시대의 여성들의 삶이 비록 양반이든 쌍놈이든 다 똑같이 절대로 대우를 받지 인간으로서의 완벽한 대우를 받지 못했다라는 거를 한 화면에서 보여주고 싶었습니다.
And although I'm running out of time, I want to tell you about my last piece, the genealogy. And Chokbo genealogy is a record of all the names of one family. But until like 200 years ago, women were excluded from this book. And in my work, genealogy, you can see two women who actually is one person. And this in the left side, the woman is sitting in a very dignified way, but her inside is shown through the other form where she's hanging herself. She is not treated well enough. So and in those ages, both noble families and those that were not noble families, in those families, women were not treated well enough. They were not treated as humans. And I wanted to express that through my work.
네. 대충 얘기가 된 것 같은데요. 또 마지막 질문을
아니, 이제.
네, 알겠습니다.
감사합니다. Ahree, did you forget the question? Do you want me to repeat or? Yeah, I think our mic needs to be. Do you remember the question?
That my relationship to portraiture, okay,
Yeah.
the mic is on. Yeah, my relationship to portraiture is much more oblique. I never set out to be portraitist, and I kind of became an accidental portrait maker. The first video that I showed you, me, I used myself as a subject because I was the only person I knew I could rely upon to have a picture taken of every day. You know, I'm always with myself. I can always snap a picture of myself, but if it were any other subject, I would have to chase them down and get on their case. So that's how that became an experimental self-portrait. And I think where I relate to portraiture is more in the idea of how portrait can be an expression of an individual's story or community story. And it's not so much as replicating a physical appearance as it is representing what's going on emotionally or psychologically, or what history this person or this community has experienced. Mm-hmm. And I think about portraits of a certain era were intended, you know, like maybe European portraits of like the Northern Renaissance, or these wealthy people who could all of a sudden had the opportunity to pay someone to make a glorified picture of themselves and, you know, uplift their own identity. And contemporary portraitists like Kehinde Wiley taking subjects who were looked down upon in society, Black men specifically, and treating them in portraiture in the style of those same sort of Northern Renaissance painters or other painters of opulent styles in previous eras. And what I try to do in my work is I find these stories, or these stories come to me, or I relate to these stories through my own lived experience of people whose stories have not been regarded as important in society, people whose position has been looked down upon in society, but I relate to them through my own personal, my ethnic background, my lived experience in my relation to the technology sector, through my being a woman, my relationship to domestic labor, and taking their positions and elevating them and telling their stories through the work that I make. And through this kind of activity, creating a picture of them in a kind of more metaphorical sense.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure it's a working process too. You started with me, the video of everyday selfies. That's congrats on the 20th anniversary. But also as you moved on from that earlier work to Bojagi and permutation, the idea keeps developing, the idea about portraiture, whether individual or collective. And I'm sure it's a working process, as in you constantly have to negotiate with your own identity. And we can definitely talk more about it later, but I think it must be a very interesting development.
Yeah, it's not something, my own identity was not something I set out to really engage with in my art practice, but it was easy. It was an easy source of material. Actually, right before I created those two videos, Bajagi and Permutation, I had just finished a series that used my family home movies from when I was a child. And these are home movies like the ones that were in the Asian American Family Home Movie Archive from the Center for Asian American Media. You know, my parents shot them on vacations or like at my birthday celebrations. You know, they're very much in that same kind of style. And I had mined that as like it was an archive and turned those into a body of 3 videos. And I think going through that process made me start to engage with my past history and my upbringing and my my Asian American identity in a way that I hadn't really engaged with it before.
Great. I did have a lot of questions, but since we're quite behind our schedule, was there any other question you wanted to ask to Yoon, since this is also a conversation between you and Yoon?
I wanted to say how much I feel awkward addressing a screen, but here we are in a hybrid program. But I really admire your art practice, and I was so delighted to learn that you were going to be in this exhibition as well. I encountered your work a few years ago at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery and was so struck by the work that I saw and intrigued, and so excited to find another Korean woman artist who had, you know, achieved this level in the art world. And I'm so honored to be on this program with you. But I wanted to, I'm so amazed how you were able to, in this society that was so so repressive in so many ways, there's an artist I admire, Todd Gray, who uses this term colonizing the mind to describe how he, as an African American, grew up in a society where his own mind was kind of ingrained with these ideas of how things should be according to the system of Blackness and whiteness, and how he constantly had to work against that. And I'm amazed that you, as a woman growing up in this very patriarchal society, were able to create this group with your fellow female artists and work against that system. And I wonder if you relate to that term of colonizing the mind and how you are able to work against that while being part of being subject to that system.
That's a great question, by the way.
대답을 하면 됩니까? 당연히 사고의 식민지화는 아주 어려서부터, 태어나기 전부터라고 저는 생각해요. 태어나기 전부터 벌써 몇천 년 동안 내려왔지만, 그거를 내가 이게 사고의 식민지화라는 어떤 단어로 얘기하기 이전에 이미 생각하는 모든 것은 나는 두 번째야. 그러니까 남성은 첫 번째, 여성은 두 번째라는 사고가 아주 뼛속에 갇혀 있었죠. 왜 그렇죠?
Of course, I relate to this notion of colonizing the mind. And I think it happened even before I was born, and it was actually passed down generation to generation. And even before I understood this concept, I always had thought that I am second and the first are the men, my brothers, and it was actually ingrained in my bone.
이거를 뭐 역사적으로 몇천 년 전부터 거슬러 올라가서 우리가 얘기할 수는 없고요. 지금 현재 만약에 제가 그런 의식이 없었다면 동생을 위해서 전 고등학교만 졸업하고 취직을 했겠습니까? 그 고등학교 밑에는 남자가 셋이에요. 남자 동생이 셋인데 남자 동생 셋을 대학까지 공부시키기 위해서 나는 희생한 거예요. 그 당연한 거로 받아들인 거죠. 당연한 것뿐만이 아니라 꼭 내가 해야 될 일이다. 마치 무슨 그게 굉장히 큰 은혜를 받은 것 같이 했다는 거죠. 이거 자체가 이미 얼마나 뿌리 깊게 머릿속에 남성 중심 사상이 저한테 있었는가 하는 얘기가 되는 거죠.
And of course, we cannot go back to all the historical backgrounds of this happening to us now. But if I did not have this colonizing of mind in myself, then I wouldn't have supported my brothers to go to college, even though I never went to college. I didn't go to college. And it was as if my mind was deeply colonized even before I knew.
저는 아무튼 그래서 역사적 현 사회적인 얘기를 하기는 너무 시간이 작은데 짧을 수밖에 없는데요. 아무튼 이 의식이 한국에 태어난 여성의 의식에서 이것이 완전히 사라지는 것이 언제가 될까요? 100년 후일까요? 200년 후일까요? 저는 모르겠어요. 그렇지만 지금 많이 노력을 하고 있으니까 깨우쳐 가고 있으니까 아마도 빨리 그런 세월이 오겠죠.
And I cannot discuss going to all the social elements or social political aspects of this problem, but I always ask, when will this notion or this concept disappear from the women, that we have to sacrifice ourselves for men and that men come first? Maybe it will take 100 years, 200 years, but still we are all working on that very hard. So I believe that sometime, one day we will achieve that.
그래서 그 생각 때문에 약 150년 전, 120, 30년 전에 총을 들고 그 일본을 대항해서 싸운 여성들 얘기를 하고 있는데, 이게 반드시 일본만을 향해서 싸우는 게 아니라는 자기 자신의 자아를 발견하는 하나의 방법이 아니었을까? 라는 생각을 하면서 작업을 하고 있습니다.
And because of this, I've been painting women who fought against Japanese colonization about 150 years ago. But I wanted to depict that they're not only fighting against the Japanese occupation, but they're also fighting to find themselves, their own self.
Thank you. Was there anything else you wanted to add? Or just to keep us in time, we're already going
Well,
over
we
time.
want to ask
a
the
little.
one question from the audience. Is that okay?
Sure, yeah,
Do you want?
we're moving on to Q&A now then.
Well, is that okay to move?
Yeah,
into-
yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
So this was for Yoon Suknam, and that's along the same lines. Did you have any differences of having exhibitions in the beginning because you were a woman? Difficulties having exhibitions because you were a woman?
여성이라는 이유로.
여성이라는 이유를 그 어려움을 겪은 경우가 없는데요. 그게 다행히 제가 40살에 시작했고 제 주변에 화가 여성 친구분들이 많이 있었어요. 그 대학을 졸업하고 대학원 졸업한 그 친구들이 같이 전시를 하자 했기 때문에 저 개인적으로 무슨 그 피해를 본 적은 없죠. 네.
To be honest, I've never been treated differently or had difficulties because I am a woman to hold exhibitions, because although I started when I was 40 years old, I had a lot of friends who majored in art and who are already the well-established artists. So they invited me to have exhibition along with them. So that's why I didn't have many difficulties.
그렇지만 한 가지 그런데 제가 첫 번째 개인전의 제목이 나의 어머니였거든요. 나의 어머니라는 전시를 사실 그 당시에 전혀 화가로서의 알려지지 않은 사람이 이렇게 큰 전시를 할 수는 없었는데 어떤 경우가 돼서 아무튼 그런 전시를 하게 됐는데요. 그 전시를 보러 온 화가들이 제가 너무 인상 깊었고 약간 슬프기도 했던 것이 그 왔던 화가들이 전부 남성이에요. 여성 작가는 거의 한두 명 있었지 않았나 싶은데요. 그 많은 남성 작가분들이 오셔가지고 그냥 끝까지 좋은 말씀하시고 같이 전시하자라는 얘기도 했는데 여성 작가가 거의 없었어요. 그때 제가 굉장히 속으로 놀랐습니다. 어떻게 이런 환경이 있을 수가 있지? 하여튼 놀랬다는 그 기억이 있습니다.
But I want to add one more thing that when I held my first solo exhibition, which for which I was very lucky to have, which was titled My Mother, a lot of artists came to visit my exhibition, and I was very much stunned or sad at the same time because most of the artists that visited me were men. I couldn't find, like, I only found 1 or 2 women artists who came to see my exhibition, and I was very much surprised to see that there weren't as many women artists.
Thank you. I think it's super interesting, and just to acknowledge Yoon, and I'm only imagining, but in the 80s when she first started painting figurative, even portraiture 40 years back, I think the gallery and the museum scene mostly consisted of abstract painting in the 80s and up to 90s. So it's so admirable of her to just pursue what she thought was the right thing for her to do. And I think the 3 of us lived very obviously different lives in terms of generation and geography, but also we share this something as women of Korean descent, we share this something in common, that these experiences that shaped us, but also made us want to break from the while living under it. So I'm going a little too deep for the sake of time, but just I thought that was a great question. So if you can add anything to that.
I just wanted to add that I find it remarkable and inspiring that you, Yoon, Suknam, were able to group together with fellow female artists, and that together you are stronger than you would have been if you had been trying to work separately, and you all helped each other out.
Like the October meeting, and I think she had several more like that. So she's always had these cohorts of women artists who support each other, which is amazing. Well, should we go on? And I think it's 6:15, so we can start wrapping up here, but I also wanted to end this with a little fun chat. And I wanted to ask you and both of you, if there's any underrated Korean food that we should know about. I know, sorry. Did you want to go first, Yoon?
So you're talking about food, right?
Yeah, we moved on from art.
아니,
No more art.
너무 많이 알려진 한국 음식인데요. 비빔밥을 저는 굉장히 좋아하거든요.
Although it's not underrated, I really
No,
love
it's not. I'm sorry, but Korean barbecue, kimchi, bibimbap shouldn't be part of the answer. So can you pick another one?
불고기, 김치, 네, 비빔밥은 뭐 당연하죠.
글쎄요, 저기 콩나물 무침은 어떨까요?
Bean sprout salad?
콩나물 아세요?
Do you know 콩나물 bean sprout? 네.
콩나물 무침.
It's a muchim. It's a kind of salad. You put sesame
Salad. Yeah. That's like always a staple for side dish, but so great. You can use it. What about you, Ahree?
For me, I think it's just called chun. The little fried pancakes. They're like little tidbits of food. It might be fish or zucchini or maybe other vegetables that are sliced thin and then put in an egg and flour batter and fried. And my mother makes the best ones. And I heard there's a restaurant in LA that just opened that specializes in them, and I cannot wait to go there.
It's actually called Korean pancakes in English too, but just like pancakes, it's really difficult to make really good ones. They're always good and delicious, but really difficult to make good ones. So I'm jealous of you that your mother used to make great ones. Okay, well, thank you everyone once again for joining us tonight, whether in person or online. And thank you for, come visit again. And again, Likeness and Legacy goes until November 29th. So thank you.
And you can visit the exhibition now.
Right now, we open late today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yun Sang.